When I came into office, we had gone through, before I took office, 2018, which was a season, particularly in the southwestern part of Florida, where you had really, really severe red tide. It had caused a lot of problems that affected the economy and tourism, and it was a major issue, particularly in that part of the state. But we've also seen red tide historically up and down the western coast of Florida, and has really been documented since I think the 1840s in Florida as something that happens. So when I came into office, we signed our Environment Executive Order, directed action to ensure protection of environment water quality, focusing on collaboration, scientific advances, and transparency. We called for the reorganization of the Red Tide Task Force, which had been dormant for the previous 15 years. And so this is a task force that's comprised of leading scientists and researchers and plays an important role determining strategies to research, monitor, control, and mitigate red tide and other algal blooms in Florida's waters. After a comprehensive review of recent experiences and scientific literature, the task force identified recommendations to fill information gaps, improve communications, and enhance research and innovation. Also, the task force established a grant program to address these recommendations, which funded projects to improve statewide red tide communication and real tide detection of red tide. The task force continues to meet quarterly to find solutions to the very complex and unpredictable issues affiliated with red tide. These efforts are supported by the Center for Red Tide Research at Florida FWC. I recommended the creation of the Center for Red Tide Research in my first budget back in 2019. The center was established within the Research Institute and has received $4.8 million each year since 2019 to detect, track, and mitigate red tide and to support the task force. Additionally, I also signed into law in 2019 Senate Bill 1552, which established the Red Tide Mitigation and Technology Development Initiative. This initiative is a partnership between FWC's Fish and Wildlife Research Institute and Mote Marine Laboratory to develop technologies and approaches to control and mitigate red tide and its impacts, and they'll be discussing some of the things that they've been doing. This bill included an annual appropriation of $3 million per year for 6 years, totaling $18 million, and more than 20 projects are currently underway. So I want to thank everybody that's been involved. I think we have some of the best in the business who are looking at these issues and researching the issues, and obviously we've put our money where our mouth is by devoting a lot of resources to be able to do all we can to help to mitigate any effects. So we're going to go around. Everyone's going to say what's on their mind. We'll have probably a discussion after that. So we'll start with Eric Sutton.
Thank you, Governor. And it was, I think, day 2 or 3, you came after you were elected and talked about water quality and including red tide. So we appreciate your support very much. One of the key things to manage red tide is communication. And that's something that I feel like we've made great strides in since you've taken office. For instance, we have an interactive map out there, and anyone can go to it within a matter of a couple of clicks to see in almost real time where red tide is occurring. And often it's patchy, it's localized, it's not widespread, and it's important for us to communicate that, and you'll probably hear from Marty why that's important. We also have a weekly update, so you can look at the map, you can read what's going on. You can do it right now and find out, there's some patchiness off of Dunedin or off the Honeymoon Island area. But also what we do and we have developed is a network with our partners being, local governments, local tourism officials, weekly. We've done that weekly since, just to let them know we're available, give them the right information, because we want the right information to be out there so that it helps protect the economy, because we know red tide can do that as well. So we have communication is a key strength, and it's also cross-linked, Sean, with protecting Florida together. There should be no reason anyone can't quickly find out is there red tide, where is it, and how can I plan around it. So communication has been a real important element, and we're pretty proud of what we've put together and under your direction. So thank you.
So, and how is that different between, you go back, I don't even like 10 years ago. I mean, obviously, red tide is something that we see annually in some form. If we go back 10 years, what would have been somebody's ability to identify what was going on?
You would have to navigate through, if you went on the web, a few more clicks, but also the map wasn't updated like every day. So you would have old maps kind of showing, and it wasn't as refined. We've expanded our ability to sample with a lot of different partners. So you have more sampling locations, which provides more accuracy, and it's more real time than it was 10 years ago. Great leaps in technology has helped us communicate better.
Great. Okay, Sean?
Well, I hate to echo what Eric's saying. Communication's been the key, right? Working on the platforms, and there's a lot of data, there's a lot of science, but if you can't consume it in real time and a value add for the purpose of whether that's tourism, whether that's for science, and or just water quality awareness, and so just our efforts to integrate those platforms, right? We're protecting Florida together, making sure it is also a one-stop shop. You know, when you consider all of the efforts at your direction, Governor, to invest resources in blue-green algae as another, water quality concern, but also taking that data, that science, and that information and assimilating into one central location gives that comprehensive view that is so important as we think about the effectiveness of our actions, right, and what we're able to disclose to our stakeholders. And I think, too, just one more thing that's important. If you think about the efforts of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, right, we've got some amazing science on that task force. We got some amazing science on this task force as well. And so if you think about the opportunity for those two task forces to share information, to share new discoveries, to share thought processes, theories, again, just exponentially increases that potential when those two entities come together. And so, which I'm looking forward to doing, right? Bringing those two entities together so they can also, have a direct connection to be able to do just that. So,
Great. Okay. Dr. Crosby, Marine.
Yes, sir. And I thank you, Governor, for bringing us all together today to talk about this important issue. Moat and our partners at FWC have been studying red tide for well over 20 years. But I really want to applaud you and your partners in the legislature. We've learned a lot about red tide and the dynamics over more than 20 years. But you and the leadership in the legislature came together to embrace a vision that we could work together, take the science, and actually do something with it to mitigate the impacts of red tide. As you mentioned, it's a naturally occurring phenomena. There's no silver bullet that's going to eliminate it. But what we can use is the knowledge that we have gained to develop innovative technologies to decrease the impacts of red tide when it does occur. And that's what this initiative is all about. To date, in a little over a year of this initiative, we have already issued 3 different requests for proposals to attract the best and brightest minds in science and engineering from not just the state of Florida, which is loaded with that talent, but from all around the United States and the world. We are bringing together the best and the brightest. We've already looked at over 125 different technologies and compounds. We have had 75 proposals that have come in. We are currently underway with 25 different projects, 20 different partner institutions. We were looking at a suite of different compounds that can be used. We've already demonstrated several of them in small studies in the field, but we're going through very methodically each one of these technologies, whether it is allelopathic chemicals that other organisms, other algae actually produce naturally chemicals to inhibit the growth of other algae like Corynea. Can we use those chemicals? Ozonation, robotics, different kinds of light. We have private companies, we have other nonprofits, we have other universities that are all coming together, and I am convinced that this initiative is going to develop those technologies that we can deploy in different situations, whether it's a canal in a resident area, whether it's offshore of beaches here in Gulf of Mexico, whether it's in Tampa Bay, Sarasota Bay, Charlotte Harbor. We're going to have a tool chest that is going to be deployable to mitigate these impacts to our environment, to our economy, and to our quality of life. And it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't, number one, based on good sound science, but number two, the leadership that you and your partners in the legislature have shown to embrace this vision to do something with the science. So thank you for that.
What's the explanation for, like in 2018, particularly Southwest Florida, real severe, and then 2019 was much better. Do we know kind of what makes for worse red tide seasons than not?
I won't play an arrogant scientist and say, yes, we know, because we don't know all of the forcing functions. We have learned a great deal about the combinations of currents, temperature, biological competition or lack thereof. But the key is red tide begins far offshore, 30, 40 miles, and you know this. You can give me a tutorial on it. It comes inland when the currents are right, and then it takes advantage of the nutrient load that naturally occurs in the coastline of the Gulf of Mexico here in Florida. That's why this is such a highly productive area. It requires that nutrient load to actually support that entire food chain and all the fisheries that we have. But when you get a little bit of a perfect storm, every year you're going to have red tide. And as Dr. Hubbard can tell you, it's always out there. But when you get that perfect storm, if you will, of conditions both physical, chemical, and biological, then you get these blooms. And if the winds and the currents are the right way, it stays a little longer. If they change a little bit, we can separate them out. I would suggest, and USF is actually leading in this effort in terms of forecasting. They've got some great scientists here that are leading in that area. We can predict a hurricane much more easily than we're going to be able to forecast red tide. And that's because a hurricane is built primarily on physical variables in modeling. Red tide includes in the chemical aspects of the right nutrients. There are over a dozen different nutrients that red tide utilizes. So the concentrations of those nutrients, but also the biological component of competition within the ecosystem. So it's going to be a great challenge to be able to forecast red tide, but I think we're making great advances with our partners at USF on that. And that's why we've got to continue the partnership with FWC. You have funded them with the center there. That's instrumental to keep that science going and get even more knowledge.
Great. Well, it's a great segue to Dr. Frazier.
Yes, and it's a pleasure to be here again. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to oversee kind of the activities of the Blue Green Algae Task Force. And in that capacity, I had a tremendous amount of time and opportunity to converse with those scientists and interact with the HAB Task Force as well. And one of the things that came out of that, obviously, is the need to reduce nutrient inputs into our coastal waters. And again, the action at the state level allowed us to do that. We're aggressively moving forward. But it gets to Dr. Crosby's point. I think what's on a lot of people's mind is, did Piney Point, for example, cause this red tide? And the answer to that is no, it didn't. But what you saw prior to the Piney Point incident was a fair amount of red tide down south, right? But there was a progressive movement of that red tide along the coast, due in large part to currents and tides, and we do a very good job of forecasting that, as Mike said. But it continues to move more north, right? But the concern really is whether or not, again, that Piney Point fueled what we're seeing here off Pinellas County and up by Clearwater. And I don't think you can make a definitive cause and effect type of a relationship at this point. But what I can say is that we all understand that increased nutrient delivery to our coastal waters can exacerbate these blooms and can kind of fuel them for some period of time. So I'm pretty pleased with the efforts on behalf of the state, or on part of the state, to reduce those nutrient inputs moving forward. So that's, again, we're in a good spot that way.
Great. Okay. Gil McCrae.
Governor, it's great to have you at FWC's Fish and Wildlife Research Institute. We have been a hub for red tide research and monitoring for over 60 years. In fact, it was one of the reasons for our founding. The scientific name, Karenia brevis, for the red tide organism, honors a former director of the Institute. She's pictured up there in black and white. Karen Steidinger still works with us today, believe it or not, on red tide. So one of the issues over the years with our program, and again, it's been decades, is the support for funding. And we have a network of partners that's necessary to respond to red tide. It's a statewide issue. We need all the help we can get. The funding would rise and fall depending on whether we had events or not. So if we went a few years without a severe event, the funding would drop and our ability to respond and maintain this network of partners would be diminished. So we want to thank you for your recognition that continued support is critical for keeping this network intact and responding the way we need to respond. People don't realize that every dot on that map, there may be 2 days worth of work behind a particular dot. The technology is just now emerging to automate some of the work we do with red tide, but the state of the art is still grab a water sample, bring it back to the lab, have an expert look at it to determine what's there in the water. And we'll evolve out of that over time, but right now we need an army of folks to help us do that, and we can only do that with continued support, and we appreciate your recognition of that fact. And one of the biggest things, the biggest two things are the reinvigoration of the Red Tide Task Force, which is already making a difference, making investments in public health, making investments in improving technology for detection, like I mentioned earlier, and actually framing up a communication strategy that's informed by emergency response, because essentially what we're doing in part is emergency response. But more importantly, the establishment and support of our Center for Red Tide Research, which is really, as I said, the hub for bringing the dozens of partners together that are necessary to do this work. And Dr. Kate Hubbard leads up that group.
Great. Okay, Dr. Hubbard?
So I just wanted to mention that the 2017 to 2019 bloom was not the only severe event. These severe events occur roughly every 10 to 15 years going back in history. And so with the recommendations of the Red Tide Task Force and the formation of the Center for Red Tide Research, as Gil mentioned, we've been able to work to really bolster our ongoing relationships with USF and Moat Marine Lab, but we've also been able to develop new partnerships with universities and partners across the state. And this has allowed us to really advance the types of research that we're doing to help advance cellular detection, to help look at the connections between nutrients and how cells grow in the lab, to be able to take that back out into the field. And that really is important for thinking about how to deploy some of those mitigation strategies that are being developed. We also have a lot of new technology that we can deploy out in the field autonomously, so that we can be out and we can be in the lab or out on a ship, and we can be looking and seeing what's going on, having robots collecting data for us. And so these advancements have really made a huge difference in our ability to work statewide to detect what's going on when there's a bloom, but also when there's not a bloom going on. And this is really critical for understanding the conditions that are important for promoting these blooms, but also for understanding what happens and what's going to happen when they're, what might be causing blooms to go away naturally, but also, how we might use that technology more efficiently, more effectively, and minimizing any potential harm on the environment. And so that extensive partnership, I think, has really been huge, and it's been just something that we've been really, really proud to be able to help advance, and it's been a huge step forward.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Okay, Marty Harity, can you just talk about Dock Ford's and where they are? It's a little bit outside of this market, but it's a great spot.
Well,
I know you have. How many do you have now?
Well, we have seven stores,
Yeah.
and one more coming. And,
Okay.
it's
How far? So you have Sanibel, Fort
Sanibel,
Myers.
Captiva, Fort Myers Beach, St. Pete.
Oh, you do have one in St.
We
Pete.
have one on the pier, and we're going to have
Oh,
another
that's
one
right.
open
Okay,
probably
yeah,
the
yeah.
latter part of this year off of John's Pass and stuff. But
Okay.
and we're very thankful that we happen to be in this state, and thank you for your leadership
Sure.
and whatnot. It's the thing that's most exciting for me is to see the science and the environment and the economy getting together. It's all the same. We all depend on one another. And, in the past, like in 2018 was devastating. There were no people here. There were hundreds of thousands of pounds of fish. And, and it comes and it goes and that kind of a thing. But to have a focused task force now that's going to stay on this thing, that's the most important thing. Accept that we have a problem and then address it. And you need that kind of leadership. And thank you for that we have that kind of leadership, because we can fix this. Right? It's always going to be there, but you have to learn how to deal with it. And communication, I hear that. I use that word all the time in my business. You have to be able to communicate, whether it's with my employees, whether it's with my customers, that kind of stuff. You have to be able to communicate. When you hear red tide, right away it's like, oh my God, the beaches are closed. And that's not the case. That's absolutely not the case. And again, to see this happen, I'm just excited in any way we can help. That's what we're here. Thanks for everything you're doing, Governor.
So in terms of some of the stuff, and whoever wants to jump in, I know people have talked about different things. I mean, for like talking about like using some type of clay to treat it. So I know like there's efforts to test some of this. So I mean, can you give us an update or anybody about like kind of what technologies are and what are the potential promises? I mean, I think and I think you said this, it's naturally occurring. It's not like something that's going to ever be eliminated, but can you mitigate so you don't have, 2018, or if 2018 happens, you can make it to where it's a little bit more, less devastating?
Yeah, that's a very good point, Governor. My colleagues over at FWC a moment ago were talking about the critical need to develop new technologies, new ways to detect red tide, very, very important for the forecasting. But we also, this was the first of its kind. Nothing like this has ever been initiated, this new initiative for 6 years to develop the tool chest, right? So where do you want to test these things? Okay, now in the 40s there was, I think there was a call from someone in Florida for the military to come out and bomb red tide. They thought, well, we'll bomb it out of existence. Then in the late 50s, I think it was, copper sulfate was sprayed on red tide. We know how to kill red tide. That's easy to kill. It's how do you decrease the impacts of red tide while not causing further harm to the environment, because the environment is what it is all about. The culture of the state, the economy of the state is all built on this environment. So we had to build a whole new facility, a testing facility as part of this initiative. And Governor, I'm going to invite you today. We just completed it. It is up and running. I'd love to have you and your entire team, and of course our colleagues and our partners, come down for a ribbon cutting of this new facility, where that is where we are testing all of these technologies before we take them out in the field to ensure that they're not going to cause greater harm. Now, we've already demonstrated a patented ozonation process will work in small-scale canals. The clay technology is something that has been used for well over 100 years in certain areas of the world to deal with harmful algal blooms, but we've taken it to a whole new level to try to use smaller particles that actually have adsorbed on the outside certain compounds that will attract Karenia. The density then causes them to sink. But when do you use that, and when is it not wise to use it? We're starting to look at quaternary ammonium compounds that are adhered to different hard substrates that will decrease the impacts. UV light, small little robots, nanotechnology we're starting to look at as well. And I think one of the most promising is Mother Nature's own, which is the allelopathic chemicals that other algae that are naturally occurring here in Florida, whether it's ulva, whether it's gracilaria, there's other macroalgal organisms that extrude chemicals naturally to inhibit the growth of other algae. That one is also very, very promising. So we are now starting to focus on those compounds that pass through the first tests at a lab scale to go to these larger mesocosm scales at this massive testing facility, and then we will be going to field deployment. And that's where we'll have to work very, very closely with DEP, with FWC, to make sure we have all the permits in place to do the field testing to demonstrate proof of concept. And then, and this is going to be this next year, we're really going to have to start ramping up the engineering development to deploy this. This is not about Mote Marine Laboratory getting in a crop duster or a ship and going out and spraying this every time there's a red tide. We're going to grow a whole new science-based industry here in this state that is going to be able to use this advanced technology to be deployed against many different kinds of harmful algal blooms. So we're very, very excited. We're very positive about this. And Gil's point was absolutely on target. The consistency of funding is critical, and that's why I think the legislature with your leadership has helped us to have that consistent funding for 6 years so that we will be able to develop this tool chest of technologies. Communication, very, very important. We were talking earlier, the map that Eric was talking about, we have that on our visitbeaches.org. That is the beach condition reporting system. We're getting hits from people in Europe that are getting ready to come to Florida for their vacation. And they're accessing this data because they see in a newspaper article or something that, oh my God, there's red tide in Florida. And they're going, wow, should we go? Well, you access this communication device and you see the science and you see where the red tide isn't. It's very patchy. And we were just talking, I was talking with Mr. Harity, this is built on volunteer citizen scientists. All of his restaurants now, we're going to have a beach condition reporting system so that his folks can actually send out to Florida and the rest of the world. No, we're open for business, okay? That red tide is 50 miles down the coast, not impacting us. Come to Florida. So all of these, also for the shell fishermen, we're developing a little widget that a shell fisherman, the very patchy nature of the monitoring system that we have, we can't get into fine spatial scales to identify. A shell fisherman has a clam bed, and he or she is going, oh my God, red tide's coming in, we're getting closed down. Well, we're developing a little widget for these shell fishermen to put in the bottom of their phone that they can take a water sample, and it will go up to the cloud and to all the appropriate state and federal agencies to show the concentration of toxin and the concentration of Karenia, as well as the actual tissue of the clam, so they can be told, yes, thumbs up, harvest now, you don't lose your crop, you're good, or sorry, we're going to have to close you. So the economic impact is very broad, and part of this initiative is to help in many different areas decrease that economic impact.
And we, I'll give you in a sec, what they're doing, I mean, obviously, we have the red tide stuff that we're talking about today, and I'm excited about the progress. We also have done the blue-green algae, primarily with the Lake Okeechobee, with the discharges. And we actually have technologies there that we're deploying. There was we had a company actually that we met in Israel on our trade mission, and they're deploying ways to be able, it's biodegradable. It basically will, will really nuke the blue-green algae. Now that's a freshwater, so, and this is saltwater, but we believe that what they're doing here could also have applications when you're looking at trying to mitigate some of the blue-green algae. I mean, we're in a situation where we had a very high lake level historically about 6 weeks ago. Haven't had as much rain, and so it's probably something that's a little bit more normal, but nevertheless, looking ahead through the rest of the summer and the rainy season, the Army Corps may be discharging. Now, we don't want those discharges during the rainy season, but the state doesn't control that. We're in a situation where we may be able to mitigate that as it comes into the estuaries, where we didn't really have that 3 or 4 years ago to really do anything. It was just kind of there. And I think the same thing's here. So I think that there's a lot of good stuff that will come of this, both for this, but I think it could have broader applications. Yep.
Yeah, I agree. And I just wanted to follow up with what Dr. Crosby said. There's I'm really excited to see the investment in the technologies, both on the red tide side of things and the blue-green algae side of things. And, there's real promising techniques, right? But you want to diversify your portfolio there, right? And so some of those technologies are allowing us to better forecast and predict, right, on very small spatial scales, these bloom events so right when they're getting formed, because the last thing you want to be able to do or have to do is to, deposit clay over, a couple hundred square miles or something, right? You want to be able to identify it when it's formed, get on it quickly, and so again, I think we're making great strides in that area as well.
Do we know, maybe one of you, because it says, the first East Coast, but I mean, this is more found on the West Coast than on the East Coast. I mean, I know it has been. Do we know the reason why it's more prevalent on the West Coast of Florida compared to the East Coast of Florida?
It's largely because of the ocean currents.
Yeah.
And so it's something where we don't yet know exactly the life cycle of Karenia brevis. So some of these algae have cysts or seeds, and we don't yet know if that exists for Karenia. We know that it's always present in the Gulf. And we know that the currents in the late summer and fall are conducive for bringing those offshore cells onshore and accumulating them. And so that's something that we've seen. In 2014, we had a bloom that never made it onshore. It stayed offshore, and we've seen that sometimes in the past. So it seems like Southwest Florida is an area that's impacted repeatedly, but we do see blooms fairly regularly also in the Panhandle. And again, that's related to currents. When we do get blooms on the East Coast, that's much less frequently, but they usually first make impact around West Palm Beach, and that's because of the bathymetry and how those currents carry the cells around the southern tip.
And the Gulf Coast, as Dr. Hubbard was alluding to, has a much broader, relatively shallow shelf than the East Coast as well. And as she mentioned, whether they insist and go down about 100 feet and just sort of sit down there at the bottom, and then the right current conditions bring them up. Very different dynamics, although, as you know, Indian River Lagoon and other areas have different kinds of harmful algal blooms. And it's very, very important, and I know you know this, Governor, but it's very important for the public to understand. Each one of these harmful algal bloom species has a different life cycle pattern, different forcing functions, and as you alluded to, will require slightly different approaches to mitigating them. But as long as we're all working together on this, I think we're going to be able to actually leverage all to actually leverage off of everything that the different initiatives are doing to really get a handle on harmful algal blooms across the board.
And Sean, I know we had, Pinellas County had reached out to us about potentially some support. Are you working to identify some resources to be able to help?
Yes, sir. We've already reached out to them and engaged the county directly and trying to get a sense for what their expenditures are thus far and what that looks like long term, short term and long term. And so hopefully we'll be able to identify a source for them to be able to support them as they kind of work through this initial impact. So that's promising.
2021 so far, how's it been?
Outstanding, absolutely outstanding. And again, I mean, it's nice to be open and that kind of stuff. I mean, red tides that are coming that we see, we kind of overcome a little bit. It's not the whole beach and so forth. You have to communicate that. So this is outstanding as far as going in that direction. But we're going to have a banner year in 2021.
No, it's good, and just that's why when we did the, when we were down, we went down. I remember when I was running for governor, and we said this was something that because someone will say, "Oh, there's fish or something," and this, and then the someone in Ohio thinks it's like on every Florida beach, and this day is just not. I mean, it's something that's very, even in the 2018, which was more, there was still, you got to look, and so having this information, being able to communicate that, and letting folks know, that these places are open, the hotels, the restaurants, the beaches are open, and that if there is an event that affects a particular location, you obviously will have the information on that. But you have people thinking because you had something off Sanibel that somehow you couldn't go to St. Augustine or something, and so the communication, it really, people's jobs depend on you communicating properly. People's businesses. We're really happy with how people are doing. I think what Marty's rundown of how they're doing is not uncommon in Florida. People are doing very, very well. Every time I go out, someone will tell me, thanks for keeping us open. Not only am I doing well, usually when they talk about this year, 21, a lot of times it's we are doing better than we ever have done. And that's something that's been common. So we're proud of that, but we also want to make sure that the communication is good. People have access to the accurate data and can be able to govern themselves accordingly. So you have anything else?
Well, Governor, I appreciate you taking the time, appreciate your support. As I mentioned to you, one thing you can count on is you've got the world's leading experts on this issue. And my job and Sean's job is to make sure we're all communicating in a way that the public can understand, and that's what we're doing. That's what we're going to continue to do. So thank you.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody. I'm excited. Look, we obviously had to put capital behind getting the funding, and we've stuck to it. And even in a difficult budget year last year, if we own it with the COVID hitting, we made sure that we were able to keep our priorities and had to make a lot of tough decisions, but kept the momentum going. So we want to continue to do that, and hopefully in another year or so, maybe we'll do another update. You can talk about some of the other things that we're doing, and I think people really, really appreciate it. So thanks, everybody.